The release characteristics of the notes we play are an often overlooked but truly significant part of the personality of every note. It's easy for us keyboard players to release a key and conclude a note, but the manner and the actual sound of how a note comes to an end is determined by the release time setting of every sound we play. And the reason that the release time settings of every sampled instrument are incorrect, except for when they're not, is because the sonic qualities and characteristics of the ends of notes as heard from real instrumental performers depends on all manner of things, including the tempo of the notes, the specific type of articulation or gesture being played, the dynamic level, and the musical emotion that the instrumentalist wants to express at the end of a note. And it shouldn't be random, right? And, of course, the characteristics of each individual instrument when it comes to all that stuff. And considering that the release time setting for any sampled instrument is preset by the library developer and doesn't change as you play, the only time the release value will be correct is if by sheer chance it happens to be the appropriate setting for the particular tempo, gesture, dynamic level, and musical emotion for whatever you happen to be playing. And indeed, I can speak from my own experience as a sound designer for commercially released musical instruments that a lot of consideration goes into setting a release time value that will be right most of the time, but of course it can't be right all of the time, ergo, sometimes it's time to reach for the release control, so that we can shorten or lengthen the release time as needed so that the sound of our notes conclude in an appropriate way. And to give you an idea of the sheer amount of variation in release time that can occur in even just one instrument, here are a few passages played on a real clarinet. First, a staccatissimo passage played about mezzo forte or so. Next, the same passage played more staccato as opposed to staccatissimo, but at a lower dynamic and a slower tempo. Next, listen to the release characteristic at the end of these slight crescendo diminuendo gestures. And finally, two sforzando piano crescendo gestures. So here we have 4 or 5 variations in the release time of a single instrument that vary by the tempo, the type of articulation, the dynamic level being played, and the specific characteristics of the clarinet. So this is why I say that the release time settings of most sampler instruments are incorrect, not because they've been poorly programmed, but rather because there's no way any programmer, no matter how skilled, can come up with a setting that will work for every situation. Now, one of the things I hear in mock-ups all the time is that the release times are too long, and that results in what I call a mushy release, where the notes overlap into one another and just create kind of a mush of sound. And then sometimes the release times sound too short or clipped, where the ends of the notes sound unnaturally abrupt. So if a sound you're using has a release time that's too long or too short, now you know where to make the adjustment, the release time control. And don't make the assumption, as one composer once said to me, that the settings of the release time for any given sound is set that way by the library developer because that represents the most realistic sound. But as I hope I've demonstrated effectively here, that just couldn't possibly ever be the case. And in the next tutorial, I'm going to show you several examples of how I exercise MIDI control over the release time to dynamically change the character of the ends of notes.